everyone, this is Professor Hall, and today we are going to look a little bit more closely at A Princess of Mars and talk about some of the subgenres that this book is often categorized into. A lot of times I've been presenting this kind of briefly for some of our other books, but for this particular book I wanted to go a little bit more in depth. So, a little bit about the author. Edgar Rice Burroughs was born in Chicago in 1875. After marrying and having 2 children, he found himself struggling to succeed in a well-paying job and turned to writing. You cannot do that today, by the way. Most people who are writers have a job or 2 or 3. But his first book is A Princess of Mars, and it was originally published as a serialized story called Under the Moons of Mars. We talked about this before. When a book is serialized, a lot of times it will be in episodes, as this book is. It has these cliffhangers to pull you into the next story, or you can almost read a chapter as being like a little bit of a short story because of the way this was published. Eventually, Burroughs publishes 10 more books known as the John Carter of Mars or the Barsoom series. Interestingly enough, he's probably more popular for his Tarzan series, in part because there were so many adaptations of Tarzan in early film in particular, but he published over 80 science fiction, fantasy, and adventure novels. And a lot of them, I think, have been lost to time because they really are products of the time in which they were written. They also contain some ideas that today are quite problematic that we'll be talking more in depth about next time. In 1923, he created a Edgar Rice Burroughs Incorporated to protect his copyrighted works, but a lot of them are in the public domain, but the company is still in existence today. It takes care of a lot of the film adaptations, things like that. When he died in 1950, he was a writer who had made the most money from films at that time. He had earned over $2 million in royalties, particularly from the Tarzan movies, of which by that point there were 27 that had been created. So again, we have this, there's this term of blockbuster, and there's another term called a forgotbuster. Those are big blockbuster movies that we don't really remember today, and in my opinion, the Tarzan movies are some of them. Johnny Weissmuller, who starred in a lot of those movies, was an Olympic swimmer and really more famous for being Tarzan than he was for being an Olympic swimmer, which is interesting as well. So the thing about this book is that he really did create kind of a new subgenre of science fiction. When we looked at the proto-science fiction works, Margaret Cavendish and her Blazing World, another world that can only be reached via the North Pole. There are other novels written for children like Alice in Wonderland, The Well at World's End. There are books that are gothic in nature like Dracula and certainly Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which we also talked about a couple weeks ago. So there are books that kind of blend the supernatural and fantasy, but not quite in the same way as is done in this book. Much of the science fiction at the time that Burroughs is writing focused on advancements in science, inventions, machines, sometimes utopian landscapes, but Burroughs really took the elements of adventure and he added actual romance, not just romance in terms of how we talked about it before as a literary tradition with faraway plots and faraway places and improbable plots, but actual romance. So between a man and a woman and how they fall in love during this epic adventure. So the series might not be as well known as the Tarzan books, but it did influence a ton of other works, including Dune, Flash Gordon, Battlestar Galactica, Babylon 5, Star Wars, Avatar. All of these books are in this kind of space opera tradition. And here you can see Princess Leia, and I'm going to go back for a second. Not that much different than Dejah Thoris here depicted as a kind of conquest, and she's not as red as she should be, which is racist book cover, but at any rate, not that much different than what happens and how Princess Leia is in her gold bikini in Star Wars. Interestingly enough. So he really did bend these genres to create something new. There's science fantasy that kind of blends science fiction with fantasy. There are... the world is presented as being scientifically possible, particularly in terms of the anthropological elements and the evolutionary biology that we'll talk about next time. But there are also some supernatural, fantastical elements, some pseudo-scientific elements, like things that are possible, and maybe plausible, but maybe not. Planetary romances typically involve adventures in exotic alien planets where the culture of the planet is also investigated or examined. Here, I love this. Sorry, I'm trying not to laugh. Imagination, stories of science and fantasy. Here we have another planetary romance. There are aliens attacking, and this is published in 1953 for 35 cents. Love it. And he is trying to release her from these chains and from her captors. So plot points are as important, possibly more important than world building. The adventure and the romance, typically between a strong hero and a damsel in distress, take precedence over the science. In many of these stories, there's very little hard science involved. So they're not exactly, they can be sort of called soft science, but they're not really looking at psychology and that kind of thing as much as they are adventure and love and excitement. Page turners and pulps. And another genre is the space opera. Swords and sorcery is another term used. So space operas emphasize space warfare, melodramatic adventure, interplanetary battles, chivalric romance, risk-taking. There's a conflict between opponents in space who possess advanced abilities. They have futuristic weapons. A lot of stories in the 30s and 40s that were also serialized, almost like, I think this might be Buck Rogers right here, almost like this book. They're like soap operas for the time period, but with a science fiction element. Swords and sorcery books, these use there's a lot more fantasy involved. So there's a hero who has a sword, and there's a lot of times, as here, like dragons or some kind of magic. Sword and planet books, these were sometimes called. There's a personal battle with hand-to-hand combat in the setting. Very little talk of technology, a lot more about magic and fantasy and that kind of thing, but often kind of set on another planet or in the future or in the far past. So, this definitely blends all of these things together. And I want to say, too, that we're going to move on to a definition in a moment of science fantasy. But one of the reasons that I wanted you guys to read this book is because a lot of times these types of science fiction books are not studied at college or in school. They're not really analyzed. And I think that they're worth looking at. Just because something was popular does not mean that it has no literary merit. And although there are aspects of this book in the beginning with this weird framing device that we've talked about, and there are, high adventure and the love, the romance between the hero and the damsel in distress, those might not be thought of as well written, but I still think that the story definitely has merit, and there's something to it. There's something to be looked at and examined, and there's a lot more depth than I think people would realize, even though it's a page turner. So, definition of science fantasy. We looked at the definitions of science fiction before, now we're looking a little bit more at fantasy. The Oxford Dictionary calls fantasy, quote, irregular or erratic fancy in thought or action, unrestrained imagination, whim, caprice, vagary. None of these definitions really describe the major uses. The use of the macabre, gruesome ideas to horrify the reader, to make his flesh creep, its more extensive use of the discoveries of science to place man in the future as master of the universe or destroyer of the world. I love this quote. On the one hand, it panders to ancient superstitions and fears, and on the other, it projects man forward in time and space. So this is Harrison Smith in The Rise of Fantasy Literature in 1948, and he's kind of trying to explain the difficulty that people have had defining this genre. As you just saw, I talked about like 4 or 5 different subgenres that you could possibly place this book into. But I think that this last bit is the most important. How does the book look at these ancient superstitions, these fears, this mythology that we've held within us? And also, how does it project us forward into time and space? So it really is a reflection of both the past, folklore, fairy tales, mythology, and the future. Science fiction, scientific advancements, technological advancements, and it has this weird mishmash between the future and the past. And certainly, I just talked about Star Wars. If you look at Star Wars, it is supposed to occur a long time ago in a galaxy far away. That is very strange because they have ships that fly and shoot lasers, and they have the Death Star, and they have all of this crazy technology. They also have swords. They also have princesses. They also have these rogue, like Harrison Ford's character Han Solo is kind of this rogue adventurous guy, right? So yeah, it's a really interesting mix of past and future, and I think that is one of the things you really should look for as you read. So here is a short excerpt. My muscles, perfectly attuned and accustomed to the force of gravity on Earth, played the mischief with me in attempting, for the first time, to cope with the lesser gravitation and lower air pressure on Mars. Consequently, I gave a very earthly and at the same time superhuman leap to reach the top of the Martian incubator, for such I had determined it must be. My effort was crowned with success, which appalled me no less than it seemed to surprise the Martian warriors, for it carried me fully 30 feet into the air and landed me 100 feet from my pursuers and on the opposite side of the enclosure. I alighted upon the soft moss easily and without mishap, and turning saw my enemies lined up along the further wall. Some were surveying me with expressions which I afterward discovered marked extreme astonishment, and others were evidently satisfying themselves that I had not molested or hurt their young. So we have here a couple things going on. First, this idea that it is very scientifically based, that there would be less gravity on Mars, and therefore if a person from Earth went there, they would have almost superhuman abilities, like a superhero would coming to Earth, like Superman. The second is that we have Martian incubators. We'll talk more about the science behind how the Martians produce young and reproduce, but also this idea that you're mixing the future with past, right? That there are warriors, that this guy is a soldier, that he is escaping from his pursuers, and that he gives this one last jump and that it works. So yeah, I hope you can see, even from this short excerpt, a little bit of the science, a little bit of the adventure, a little bit of this swords and sorcery. So what to look for as you read. Think about how you would characterize the book. Consider the balance of science and fantasy found throughout the novel. Consider Harrison Smith's conflicting description of science fantasy that we just talked about. The idea that it's past and future kind of mixed together. How does the book speak to these ancient superstitions and fears? For example, there's a chapter called Battling in the Arena that's really reminiscent of a Roman Colosseum. In contrast, how does the book call men to project forward into time and space? The Martians have technology far beyond what the Wright brothers have devised on Earth in terms of flight. They have determined a way to reproduce asexually, right? So there's these very interesting kind of technological things going on. Do the warring Martian races show a grim, bloodthirsty view of the Earth's future? Or does the fact that John Carter attempts to heal these rifts show us how humanity is moving in the right direction? Are we going to move forward as we evolve, or are we going to regress in some ways? So look for all of those as you read and think about how you would kind of categorize this book. And next time we will talk a little bit more about some of the elements of the book, and in particular, how the author examines both the soft sciences of anthropology and sociology, and also the hard sciences that we have been kind of examining throughout this course. That's it. Thanks, everybody.